Thank you, all of you, for coming this afternoon to our Global Justice Day panel, Workplace Organizing. My name is Phil Dalton. I'm the director of Hofstra's Center for Civic Engagement and a professor of rhetoric and public advocacy. And I'm so glad to see so much interest in the panel. Today is the day that we at Hofstra recognize global justice, a day to pay special attention to the various challenges that people face, not just here at home, but throughout the world. Our modern economy has created a situation where tremendous wealth is being created, but only a select few see the benefits. And the gap between those seeing the immeasurable benefits of globalization and those whose labor and value is extracted and getting extracted from their communities, that gap is widening, and it's propelled by brutal efficiency. Devoting a day each year to acknowledging these challenges, understanding them better, and recommitting ourselves to fixing them is a priority for our center. I want to thank generally all those who invested their time in making this event possible, including the undergraduate fellows with the Center for Civic Engagement. These events would not have come together without your efforts, so thank you very much. I always make a point of thanking Executive Director for Hofstra's Cultural Center, Athleen Collins. These events always come together because of your work and attention to detail. So thank you very much. As we proceed, we ask that everyone remain muted, and that if you have questions or comments, please feel free to put them in the chat. We'll monitor that. And now, with nothing more, I'd like to introduce Professor of Teaching, Learning, and Technology, Dr. Sandra Stacki, who was, by the way, central to organizing this event. So thank you very much, Sandra.
Yes, thank you very much. Certainly we all work together on this with Maggie and Marianne also, and the interns from CCE. And I want to thank everyone for coming. And my co-moderator is...
Hi, everyone. I'm Olivia Tu. I'm a fellow at the Center for Civic Engagement. I just want to thank everyone, especially the panelists, for coming here.
All right. Thank you, Olivia. So as Phil said in a brief introduction, global justice we think of as a broad concept that's been theorized and practiced in various kinds of ways and at multi-levels, and it's with many multi-dimensional aspects. We frame it in terms of distribution of goods and in terms of rights and worker freedoms. It emphasizes access to benefits and rights of people, distribution of goods. And, we talk about unequal burdens and structural barriers for certain people and certain workers. And those are the kinds of issues that we're talking about today. And so it entails ideas of mobilizing and organizing to challenge these inequalities and injustices to try to create more equal and just a more equal and just world for individuals and also, for groups. So our aim today in the session is to have our panelists share their perspectives, connecting the local and the global around workplace organizing issues and transformative change. And as I think we had indicated, we're not doing formal presentations, but we do have some questions that we have created to ask the panelists. And we'll alternate who we begin the questioning with as we go through. And I'd like to, I'm pleased now to just introduce very briefly our 5 panelists, and as they begin to talk about some of the issues, they can certainly introduce themselves more. So we have Avir Waxman, who's a former organizer of California Uber and Lyft drivers for the Service Employees International Union. Does he want to? There he is. On my screen, he's in the middle. There he is, Avir. Okay, and kimkelly, who was chatting a little bit as some of you are coming in, a labor journalist covering the retail, wholesale, and department store union organizing drive at Amazon. And Kim, you can wave for a second there? Thank you. Supriya Baily, who's been a colleague of mine for a long time, who's a professor at George Mason University. And she has researched in many ways about adult women who are exercising agency in multiple spheres of their lives, including working issues. Supriya is there. And Clarissa Redwine is a New York University Fellow and involved with the Kickstarter Union organization. And I believe that's the first white collar technology workforce to be unionized. Is that right? I think so, Clarissa?
Full company union, yes.
Yeah, great. And then Ozoma, who is the founder and principal of Earthseed, a tech accountability consulting firm. And she comes to us today from New Mexico, I believe. Is that correct? Yes. So we have people from various places around the country joining us today to talk about some of these issues on the local level and as they affect the global level as well. So I'm going to turn it over to Olivia, who's going to start with some of the questions.
Awesome. Yeah, just to start everyone off, I was hoping to ask each panelist for a quick 5-minute introduction of what your work involves and what global justice means to you. So if anyone wants to start us off, that would be great. Otherwise, I can pick someone from the list.
We could start with Avir if you want. He was the first on my list.
All right. Hello, everyone. My name is Avir. As was mentioned, I've worked with Uber and Lyft drivers out in California. I helped start a union out in the Bay Area. Though the drivers movement is something that has been going on for much longer than that, and has been cropping up in all different places around the country and even the world. Right now, I'm actually working again with drivers, but now rather than as a professional, just in my free time, with something called the Boston Independent Drivers Guild, which I'm happy to say is actually a rank and file effort. It's entirely driver run and led, and I believe is the only effort in Massachusetts currently. The question was the concepts of individual and global justice. Is that correct? Yeah.
Right. You can just talk about what global justice means to you.
Yeah. Well, I will. I'll define it by contrasting it to individual justice. I'll start by saying that justice is historically dependent, and it is system dependent. For example, since I'm here to talk about drivers, I'll talk about drivers a little bit. For Uber and Lyft drivers, it's incredibly easy for them to get deactivated, which essentially means fired. They're kicked off the app. The reasons why are minimal, sometimes non-existent, and incredibly opaque. But what would be just in a scenario like that? Is it just to get them rehired? To give them back pay for the wages lost? Maybe firing the CEO for the person who greenlit the policies? What about doing all three? I would say no, none of that is just. But because under the existing system, all we would be doing is putting that worker back into a highly exploitative situation where they are working 60 to 80 hours a week just to get by. But maybe you change it up. Maybe you say, instead of putting them back into the situation, they've been wronged, you get them a nice cushy office job at Uber or Lyft with nice salary, good benefits. Is that just? Well, you still leave thousands and thousands of workers in the same situation that the driver left behind. The fact of the matter is that under an unjust system, you can't have individual justice. Justice is system dependent, and we as a society have moved beyond what this system is able to provide in way of justice. Global justice to me means we remove exploitation, such that it's not that one person who's wronged from exploitation can then be reinstated into that same position, but that no such situation can even arise. What that means we need to do is we need to entirely change the system we're operating within. And that can only be done through organizing and collective activity, where people move beyond conceptions of individual justice, of I've been wronged, how do I make it right for myself, to we've been wronged, how do we stop anyone from getting wronged?
Thank you so much for that answer. Maybe we can move on to Kim Kelly next.
Sure. I suppose just a little bit more about me. I'm a labor reporter. I'm also a member and council person for the Writers Guild of America East, and a member of the IWW, and involved in the No Cop Unions effort. So I'm kind of all over the place when it comes to labor. And justice is something I think about a lot, not just as someone who reports on organizing and workers' struggle for self-determination, but just as a person who's political. And so, of course, I have my own ideas about how we can get closer to a just society, domestically and globally, whether we're talking about, abolishing police and prisons, or dismantling the military industrial complex, whether we're talking about, destroying capitalism and actually confronting and dismantling white supremacy, getting rid of all of these massive systems that make justice an impossibility for so many. But since I'm here in my capacity as a labor person, I think I'd like to zero in a little bit just on what's happening here in Bessemer, because I think that's a great example of what a seemingly small domestic effort can be in terms of having a global impact. Right now, there are 5,800 workers at the Amazon Fulfillment Center here in Bessemer who are voting on whether or not they want to form the first union in the US for Amazon. And Amazon already has unionized workplaces in Europe and other locations, but this would be a first for the US. And the world is watching, right? This is a huge deal because, when it comes to these kind of labor struggles, these kind of organizing challenges, sometimes all you need is that first domino to fall. You need someone to set a precedent. You need someone to show, oh, it can be done. Because as soon as these workers win, and I do believe they'll win, then every other Amazon worker in this country, many of whom have already reached out to RWDSU, the union who is orchestrating this campaign, saying, how do we get involved and how do we do this at our place? Every worker who sees that will see, okay, you can go up against Goliath and win. And all of the other workers in all of their other global locations will see that too. And all the other warehouse workers will see that too. And all the other drivers who are delivering these goods will see that too. It all comes down to that first win and the months of organizing and struggle that went into it. And this is not just here in Bessemer, this is not just a union fight either, right? Like it is, but there's so much more to it, because this is an area that has been sort of written off by some who haven't maybe researched enough. But Bessemer is a union town. The greater Birmingham area has a rich and deep labor history and history of struggle and dissent, in addition to its civil rights history. And those things are intertwined too. When I speak to workers and organizers here, I hear all the time, this is about our rights. This is about dignity. This is, Martin Luther King Jr., he was a union man. He was speaking to the sanitation workers of Memphis in '68, right before he was killed. That image has been invoked so many times. And, it's not merely a historical a historical situation either. It comes down to what is just, what is right, what is fair. The workers here, they want to be paid better, they want better benefits, but they want more than anything, they want to be treated with dignity as people, not robots. People who are able to go to the bathroom if they need to without somebody looking over their shoulder. Someone who can show up more than maybe 1 minute late and not lose an hour of their paid time. There's so many tiny injustices that are visited upon these folks, and it's just been allowed to happen for so long. But the workers here have set this example by saying, enough, something's got to give. And now the world is watching them and rooting for them as they're getting so close to the deadline for this vote. And that is, one of the bedrocks of global justice is worker solidarity. And this is the kind of of solidarity that we need. I think Amazon workers in Italy went on strike the other day, or had an action in support of the workers here. I saw Amazon workers in Poland sending support messages. From the UK, there have been news outlets from Nigeria and Finland and Japan, all over the world, coming down to talk to these workers. And everyone's going to see what they do here, and that is just going to ripple out. And I really hope that it's going to get us one step closer to the justice that we're all fighting for and we need so desperately.
Thank you. Those are some really important points. So Supriya Baily, can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Sure, I can. First of all, I want to thank everyone for inviting me to be on this panel with some amazing people. My head's spinning just thinking about what we're going to be talking about. And, to build on what both Kim and Avir have just said, there's part of what I do has been to focus on women's agency and empowerment. And I started my career as an activist working with Burmese and Tibetan refugees in India, trying to raise awareness about the situation where they sort of were in situations where they did not have access to education, did not have access to political representation and things like that, moved into working with women's organizations around the world. As an academic, it's been interesting to look at the ways in which global dialogue around issues of collectivism and access to working spaces have been sort of in some ways twisted. So I look at a lot of women's programs in developing countries where many of us would know that microcredit is always sort of seen as this sort of Band-Aid or this silver bullet to help women access opportunities to make a living. But then through that making of a living, they're able to sort of join sort of either the non-formal, the informal, or the formal sectors of the economy. And this is where collectivism in some ways turns on its head. It's sort of where the global rhetoric around women's agency and empowerment meets this notion of collective power, but then gets turned around in ways that actually oppress women in new ways, in situations that maybe had not been foreseen, or sort of speak to the ways in which justice is interpreted by governments, where justice is interpreted differently by international organizations. So, the example that I kind of always come back to is there were a group of women who were involved in a microcredit program in a small rural village in India. And they were asked, on top of sort of their 15-hour day to sort of take care of their family, get the water, get food, get firewood, and do all of that. They were also asked to start a small business because being able to incorporate them into the informal economy was about empowerment, but it was also sort of about the neoliberal agenda for the country to move, sort of the disposable income that women had access to, because then it would promote sort of the purchasing power, right? So there's all those intersections of all these different tensions. But what happened was that as the women accessed more money and more opportunities to sort of build their little businesses, they also realized that they couldn't afford to grow the vegetables that they needed to grow to, and they had to join a factory. So here they were, these women who were part of a collective. So you already had a group of women who were working together. So it was easy to sort of tap into their resource as a collective, incorporate them into taking on debt, which is really a form of oppression in and of itself, right? So microcredit really is the invitation to partake in forms of debt that we would never invite people to do in another context, and then ask them to work in the formal sector of the economy. And so you were seeing the ways in which collective power was almost bastardized in some ways to promote the agenda of national governments or international NGOs or international entities. So I come at this from this sort of complex space of saying, yes, collective power can be incredibly transformative. Workers' rights are critical, but also what forces are at play that take those those actions and turn it into a way to promote other agendas that are not things that we're talking about just yet. So that's where I situate myself, and I'm excited to continue this conversation. So.
Thank you. It's so important with labor rights to think about it in terms of gender as well. So moving on to Clarissa Redwine.
Yeah, hi, I'm Clarissa. I'm currently a fellow at NYU working on an oral history of the Kickstarter union effort. And I guess where I would start talking about global justice is when I think about that, I do think about what Kim mentioned about this idea of a domino. And in so many ways, global justice, when I think about what that could look like, I think about the many, many dominoes that need to fall in order to make that happen. And in some ways, like at Kickstarter, we had that mentality as well, thinking, oh, if full-time workers at a tech company could build a union, how could this change tech? How would this empower workers to build things that are helpful to the community and not just extractive? How will it build solidarity from workers in different areas of a company? How will it build solidarity between workers who hold different roles or who are in different areas of the world? And it all starts with very small conversations between coworkers and between community members. And that is the kind of work that is essential for building a vision and bringing to life a sense of global justice. And I think the act of having conversations like that sort of uncover the power structures that we're all either subjected to or participating in or furthering. And it allows everyone to understand how we could make the world better for not only ourselves and the people around us, but people we don't even know. And yeah, my story of organizing started with the conversation where I heard someone at my company explaining a horrible experience that no one should ever have to go through at a company. And I had no idea that I was working at a place where I could have such a good experience and another person could have such a bad experience. And it just starts there of talking to people that you haven't talked to before and figuring out what other people want to see in the world and what their ideas of global justice is. Yeah.
Awesome. Thank you so much for that introduction. And last but certainly not least, Ifeoma Ozoma, can you please introduce yourself?
Yeah, I'm Ifeoma. I'm so happy to be here with you all today. What I want to talk about, it ties into what Avir said about if the system is unjust, then there's no justice for the individual. And to what Clarissa also said about hearing about the horrible experience that someone was having in her workplace. One of the things that I'm championing right now is a law in California, hopefully will be passed and become law in California, the Silence No More Act. And what it aims to address is non-disclosure and non-disparagement agreements, which are tools of the many that employers are using to silence people so that you can't even get to the point where you can share the stories and then begin to organize on whatever the issue is. And one of the reasons why I'm working on it, other than caring about it in general, is because of my own personal experience at Pinterest, where I realized I was being discriminated against via my wage because of race and gender. I thought I was doing everything right. Went to my manager, went to HR. I know HR is not your friend, but when you do things by the book, hopefully, like, there's the documentation and things can be resolved correctly. Of course, none of that happened. I started facing retaliation right away, and I was doing all of this while living in this sort of like cognitively dissonant space, because I was a public spokesperson on behalf of the company as a Black woman, which I'm sure they were happy to have someone with my identity doing this work on behalf of the company, while also being told that I should be grateful for what I was getting, which is something I was actually told, that I should stop trying to embarrass the company, even though I hadn't even said anything publicly. And then at the beginning of the pandemic in March of last year, I was forced out and forced to sign a non-disclosure and non-disparagement agreement that if I even shared with friends or family in a closed space, was written in such a way that not only could they sue me to get back the very small severance that I got, which I had no choice but to take because it was the beginning of a pandemic. I am not independently wealthy, and so I still needed to pay my rent. I was supporting my sister who had just lost her job. But they could also sue me for undisclosed damages and unlimited damages. I'm privileged in that I was able to hire an attorney who I paid the little that I had in savings to guide me through the process. But I was thinking after doing it, and I ended up speaking up publicly and sharing my story, but I was thinking after signing it, if I'm in a position where I know how restrictive this agreement is and how it's stripping away my right to talk about what I've experienced for the last year and a half, and I still have to sign it, how many other people are in a situation like this? And so my hope with this act in California is that it removes that barrier, because it is a barrier that exists and we rarely talk about, because if people talked about it, they would be sued by their companies for doing so. But I want us all to think through this conversation and others about the folks who are most impacted by abuse in the workplace and who often are not represented, including in conversations like this. The number of Black women who have reached out to me since reading about my story has been just overwhelming. And one of the things that's been most depressing actually is people reaching out and saying, thank you so much for speaking up, but now I know that like you and your position and your background and like the public access you had to reporters, the fact that you had a lawyer, were still screwed over. Like there's absolutely no opportunity for me to speak up, and there's no way that I could talk about what happened to me. And so I think that for those of us who care about this and who care about people being able to share their stories, we really have to highlight those stories as well. And that includes having more diverse audiences and participants in conversations like this one.
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing your story. And thank you again to all of the panelists for being here. I want to move on now to the next topic, which is about the challenges that workers face and then activists face. So this is open to any of the panelists that want to speak. If you could just talk a little bit about what the challenges are in the fight for global justice, and how do these challenges manifest on the individual, collective, structural level?
Maybe we can start with Kim this time and go around.
All right, put me on the spot. But
unless you're not ready, we can go to someone else.
No, I got plenty of opinions about all kinds of things. But I would say, especially after hearing my fellow panelists speak about this, I think it's fairly obvious that we're dealing with these massive structural issues of white supremacy and racism and homophobia, transphobia, misogyny, sexism, everything that is just working in concert to grind down workers and grind down everybody who is not already in a position of privilege and power. I mean, there's these big things, right? But there's also smaller things like the complacency and the inertia and the privilege and the kind of lazy type of racism and bigotry that you see where folks see something happening to someone who isn't like them is like, oh, well, it must be their fault. Or like, well, maybe I don't know the full story. I don't know what's going on there. It's none of my business. But it is your business. It's all of our business. that's the whole point of working together collectively. One person on their own, especially if they're already dealing with, compounded marginalized identities, they're going to have a much tougher time getting results, getting justice, than if a whole bunch of people are there of all kinds of identities, of all kinds of different kinds of privileges working together. I mean, I'm clearly a union guy and I'm pretty pro-union, I think you would say, but I think that unions, whether we're working within like the more formal, like just union, like official labor union structure, or more informal structures like worker centers, or working with the IWW, any group of workers is a union, whether or not the NLRB says so, But all that to say, like, working together is really the greatest tool we have as workers and as people, because, as these stories have shown, when you're just on your own, there's only so much you can do. Like, yes, extraordinary people are able to force change on their own, but they shouldn't have to. That's the thing. That's not fair. You shouldn't have to put all that on one person. You shouldn't have to be extraordinary to be treated like a person, it's not fair. And so it's, in terms of the challenges that I face, I think that's kind of that's where the framework that I operate within, right? Like, we're always stronger together, and we need to be, people that have privilege need to be using it, not only just to listen and educate themselves, but use that as a weapon, Like, there are things you can get away with when you look like me that other people don't have the luxury of dealing with, whether it's talking to the police or talking to a manager. Like, you need to put yourself in that role and, take those slings and arrows, because it's always been easier for you. You may as well do something helpful for once. That's something I think. This is kind of venturing into my own like personal philosophies or what have you. But and in terms of like broader, we're talking about challenges right now. Those are, I'll step backward. Those are some of the challenges and potential solutions or tactics that I think about in this topic.
Can I jump in, Sandy? Sure. Thank you. No, this notion of solidarity is so important, but it's also sort of, I think, one of the biggest challenges that I'm seeing in these spaces, especially with adult women, is the recognition that by intersecting identities, sort of saying, well, this is an issue of this group. It's, in the Indian context, is it a caste issue? Is it a language issue? Is it a religious issue? Is it a gender issue? And I think that there are powers that be that recognize that by that division, I mean, we know that division has been part of the colonial legacy for the largest time, right? You divide and conquer. And so that has continued to play a part in ensuring that solidarity is splintered. And so, whose justice matters depends on which identity you're willing to prioritize over which other identity. And I think we're seeing that here in the US, and I think that the lack of understanding by, I think, the general public about intersectionality, right? That yes, you can be all of these identities at one, has created a situation where we are fractured and we're splintered and the solidarity efforts are dispersed. So therefore they're not as effective as they could be. And I think that is sort of a really structural thing. And I don't think that that is happening sort of, by the off chance. I think there are people who are and I know I sound like a conspiracy theorist over here, but I think that there are very strategic reasons that people use that sort of division to ensure that the solidarity of groups did not work, is not effective in the way that it should be.
Yeah, I can tack on to that as well. Like, I think the many ways that workers are divided is one of the biggest challenges that we have for building global justice. And for me, like a personal example, which Ifeoma has heard me talk about before, is at Kickstarter, I joined the union effort to try and help my other colleagues that I had heard had terrible experiences. And about a month after we announced the union drive, I found out that my male counterpart, who I was mentoring and managing at the time, made 10% more than me. And it took me so long to share that fact with my fellow union organizers because of the sort of shame and pressure of like the meritocracy and individualism that I felt as a tech worker. And I feel like there are cultural ways that we're divided as well, and that companies sort of push as part of tech company culture or company culture in general. So yeah, that division on even the smallest level is so harmful to worker movements.
I think like one practical thing that's been on my mind, because it's something I'm personally dealing with right now, is health insurance. It's such a weapon that employers are using, at least here in the United States, within the context of working as an employee. And first of all, if you even have access to health insurance, that's one of the things that separates workers. And then once you have it, it's like you're trying to do everything to not lose it, especially in a pandemic. I wrote a piece about how I would not have been able to push on the issues that I was facing, even though I was still eventually fired. I just wouldn't have raised it at all if I had a kid who was on my insurance. And so the decision that I took to speak up and to push back within work was any day I could come to the office and they could be like, you know what, we've had enough of your shit, you're gone. And then all of a sudden, how am I going to pay for rent, my living expenses, and COBRA? And because of the health needs that I have, just going to the exchange isn't really an option. So there's so many things, but health insurance is one of them. And I think if we're trying to lower barriers, one of the things we have to do is address that with people, because especially in workplaces where people are making vastly different amounts, there are some people who are going to be able to say, you know what, I'm going to stick by this because even if it comes to it and I get fired, I can afford COBRA. For the folks who can't, what are we putting in place to support them? Even if it's not paying for an entire COBRA payment, can we help people with copays? Can we do things so that folks aren't left in a situation where they have to decide between their health, their kids' health, their spouse's health, and their job and solidarity?
I'll just add there's also just logistically, there's a challenge. I think, capitalism has this way of individualizing, and especially in the sectors that I've organized, which, as I've mentioned, has been Uber and Lyft drivers, but also childcare providers in California. They are incredibly individualized. Drivers, even when they are gathered in an airport parking lot, never leave their cars. They don't know each other. Childcare providers, by the nature of their work, are operating in their homes, right? Whereas 100 years ago, workers were in factories and had an ability to associate with each other. That's not the case in many sectors today. And to kind of bring it back full circle to what we were talking about at the start of this question, I'll say something that both challenges and supports the notion of identity as a barrier. In terms of identity is certainly a barrier, and there are logistical reasons to that. For example, with childcare providers, they're operating out of their homes, and geographically, we tend to be divided by community, ethnicity, and class. And there are a whole bunch of historic reasons for that, from things like redlining to immigrant communities tend to live together because there's a shared community. But what it meant was that you had white childcare providers in one location and Spanish-speaking childcare providers in another. And while they were all in the same union, they didn't get to associate with each other in the same way. And it took very active intervention to get them to realize all the conversations were happening in English, which was leaving out the Spanish-speaking providers. Right, and so even in that unity, there was division. But on the other hand, with gig workers, they come from all over, and it is so individuated, you don't have an opportunity to cluster by identity or ethnicity group. While organizing drivers, I've talked to people from Ukraine, China, Nigeria, America. They're it's all broken down. And what you can see is that there is an active effort in the drivers' movement to overcome language and ethnicity barriers and break down the barriers of identity in order to create the necessary solidarity. So yeah, just last sentence to sum up, the logistical barriers that capitalism and the individualization of identity proposes in some ways certainly pose a barrier, but that kind of breakdown can also be overcome in other ways. And there are active efforts to do so.
Thank you all. We have a couple more questions that we'd like to engage the panelists with, but I want to remind other people that if you have questions, you could begin to put some into the chat if you'd like. And we hope that when we have some time after these next couple of questions that we can let the panel answer those questions as well. Some of you have already been talking about some individual kinds of examples where injustice has been taking place. And so we wanted to ask a little bit more about, how do you create broader, more inclusive ways of collective voice and action, to think about that a little bit. And also, during the pandemic, how have your efforts, your organizations been affected, and how have groups responded to the pandemic issues that have certainly been and existing and making things more difficult? Supriya, do you want to start?
Sure. I won't talk so much about the pandemic side of things as a academic, but I think that, I was thinking about this and I was grateful for the questions coming a little earlier, because one hat that I wear is as teacher educator. And I think that we don't really talk as much about the public good anymore, as much as I think we used to. And I know that sounds very sort of like, oh, there was a perfect time that we used to do that. And I don't think we've ever done that per se, but how we distribute resources, who we educate, why we educate the way we do, why we have to have a healthy society. I don't see as clear a connection or a link to the notion of public good. And so I think sort of one way of trying to sort of think about adapting sort of this individualistic notion of justice to maybe a more collective or inclusive vision of justice has to do with maybe greater public dialogue around what the public good is and how the public good actually can support sort of collective justice. The other part of this is, I think there are allies who are working in different spaces, but yet we don't really see those who are in the margins of society in more visible and sort of mainstream roles in different types of companies or institutions or businesses or whatever it is, because visibility shows both representation and inclusivity. And I think that we really, if we're going to look at structural change, I think we have to work more closely with allies to sort of say it's not enough to talk the talk, but like, how are you walking the walk? Where is that representation? Where is the visibility? Where is the I've got your back? Which I don't think even, in institutions of higher education, which, may have a mandate around social justice or, inclusivity, you're still looking at exclusivity and you're still looking at invisibility. And so I would say, and what is unpaid labor? And we see that in almost every industry, and who carries that unpaid work is predominantly people on the margins again. And so for me, I think that would be a space to build worker power, but keen to hear on sort of how people on the ground are dealing with some of these things.
Can I pop in? I don't want to.
Thank you. Yeah, go ahead. Go ahead, Kim.
So yeah, after hearing you speak about this idea of the greater good, the public good. So this question immediately made me think of the discourse around essential workers, right? We're talking about the pandemic. We're talking about the folks that got, unfortunately, not all of us, but got a lot of us through this ongoing nightmare. And, you know, before the pandemic happened, before these essential workers, healthcare heroes, signs in the window, clapping out your front door, kind of, you know, public acknowledgement of these folks' labor, before that all happened, these were workers who were invisibilized, they were marginalized, they were oppressed, nobody was necessarily paying attention, even though their work was just as important and just as essential before we had to deal with this pandemic. And I think that is something that people are realizing. I think the workers themselves are realizing that too. And I think that's the most important piece of this. You know, I don't think it's a matter of like, oh, I saw a sign or like somebody clapped out the window at me. Like, that's nice. But I think it's more just this realization that like, my work has kept people alive. My work has kept this world turning. And these are folks, you know, we know that the medical workers are heroic, but so are the janitors that are cleaning the halls in the hospital, you know. So the delivery workers and retail workers and sanitation workers and flight attendants and the folks that, you know, are making sure the necessities are getting to people who are vulnerable, and the utility workers keeping the lights on. Like, there's so many types of essential worker now, and we know that all work is essential. But I just think the shift in both public recognition of this and the workers' own recognition of this, I think that's going to have an impact. We've seen so much more organizing across industries and specifically in spaces where essential workers like grocery store workers are. Like, we've seen them fighting to keep their hazard pay. Like, one of the big the big points of, you know, irritation here in Bessemer with Amazon workers, they talk about how the company took away their COVID pay a couple months in, and people at work are still getting sick. Like, I think it is fostering this kind of idea that we're all in this together, but some of us are treated differently, and some of us are putting in more work, and some of us are getting the short end of the stick. So I think that growing consciousness is going to have an impact, an important impact, and a really necessary impact, because, you know, it's unfortunate that it took a global pandemic that killed over 500,000 people to get people to realize that, like, the sanitation workers and the delivery workers deserve your respect and deserve to be treated properly. But we're here, so let's, you know, try not to waste this moment.
Clarissa or Avir, you want to add? Clarissa, go ahead.
Yeah. I think, this makes me think about experience at Kickstarter. I think that when we're thinking about building these broad movements, we must take a creative lens. Like, we can't come thinking that we want an end goal other than structural change. Like, structural change should be the only thing on your agenda, and everything else should be part of this collaborative, creative process with the people around you. And it's so important, especially when we think about the pandemic, for workers at Kickstarter. When we started the union drive, protections for layoffs was not on our minds at all. You know, if we had drawn up a contract or a list of demands, that would have been completely out of our scope. But because the pandemic happened to hit right after workers won recognition of the union, they were able to be part of the process of getting severance, healthcare, and support for the workers who were laid off, which would not have been the case if they didn't have that structural power within the company. So yeah, I think just for practical, like, organizing on the ground, it's so important not to predefine what wins you want to have, and to approach organizing as a very fun and exciting and motivating creative process.
Forgot to unmute. Ifeoma, would you like to add a few thoughts? You need to
Yes, I did the exact same thing. I think as much as it pertains to the pandemic, I've shared where I think there needs to be a focus. And then to Clarissa's point about what was and what wasn't on the list at Kickstarter, I think part of that has to do with when organizing, one of the things that's unfortunately left out sometimes is doing a real survey of what everyone needs. What do you need such that you can participate in this as fully as you would like to? And I think when you ask that question, you get to the things that people are concerned about, which is going to be different based on what roles people are in, and what they make and what security looks like for them. I can tell you if I were at Kickstarter, well, my number one concern would be getting fired, because as a Black woman, I understand that like, if anyone's going to go, it's probably going to be me first. So that's something that I would be concerned about and would push to have on the list. And so with the pandemic, I mean, we've just seen so much of this. I was talking to my sister who's never really thought about labor and organizing. She's a dental hygienist. They're almost always, whether you have ever spoken to a dental hygienist in your dentist's office or not, they're almost always contract workers. So they don't work for the practice that they're at, even though dentists make a ton of money. They were all fired unceremoniously without health insurance when at the beginning of the pandemic, when people started canceling their dentist appointments. And there's really no way for them to connect unless they talk to each other one-on-one in the office, because there are huge agencies that assign them to each office basically day to day. So understanding those barriers and what people need is one of the things that I think is most helpful, even outside of the pandemic context, because this is not going to be over even after everyone who wants a vaccine is able to get one.
Avir, do you want to add some thoughts, please?
To be honest, I don't have much to add. I think everyone else really summed it up very well. I would just maybe say the sentence of like, yeah, it's not, think of it in the individual way of how do I get what I need is going to be ineffective, and what it needs to be thought in the way of how do we get to the position where we can demand what we need. And that's the only way that any of it's going to happen.
Yeah, and I was thinking about, Ifeoma was talking about this a little earlier too, the idea of being just an individual and trying to speak truth to power. We hear that phrase a lot these days, and that it's so difficult to do that as an individual who may not have the resources they need. It's someone who is worried about healthcare, worried about losing a job, having healthcare for children, those kinds of things. It's much more difficult for people as individuals to be able to try to speak truth to power. And the idea that, collective action can hopefully help. But, as Ifeoma said, sometimes people become hopeless. They feel that because of their lack of resources and their lack of power, that speaking out won't be helpful for them, or won't only hurt them individually, even though we know that we want to try to do that as a collective good. So it's a difficult situation for many people. Thank you all. We have one more question that also I think people can put things in the chat. I know a couple of the panelists have already put some links in the chat to some of their organizations, but we had wanted to ask that, how would you recommend to individuals or institutions, communities, how should people get involved in global justice efforts? And how do we create these alliances and solidarities? I mean, I know you've been speaking to that a little bit already, but how should people think about trying to get involved? And as I said, you could put some things in the chat if you have some links for people to see. Who wants to, Ifeoma, do you want to start with this one?
Sure, I have a really quick answer locally. And locally, I think means both geographically and then to whatever your area of expertise is. Because as much as I support what's going on in Bessemer, that I have no direct connection. So I can give financially, but to try to insert myself in it would be ridiculous when there are folks who need support right here in Santa Fe and then within the tech community that I know.
I can jump in. I think when we're talking about supporting efforts that maybe we're not individually a part of, it's so important to ask those groups what they want, what they need, instead of just assuming that whatever you're going to do in solidarity is going to be helpful, because oftentimes it's not. As we've seen with Amazon, there have already been some efforts that were maybe made in good faith, but were not helpful. So, and with Kickstarter as well, there were people calling for boycotts when we were trying to win recognition, and it was not what the organizers wanted at all. So yeah, so asking those groups how you can help is one of the best ways to start. And then also what Ifeoma said, even just having a conversation with one other coworker, that is an act of organizing, and it's a very important first step. Yeah, and then just remembering to take care of yourself too. That's really important.
Yeah, I would just, I'm like 100%, y'all are both right. And man, that Amazon pseudo boycott was a nightmare for people down here. So yeah, always ask to see what people actually need. Because you might think like, oh, I know this and this and this, and I have all this stuff I can offer. But do they need it? Do they want it? Is it helpful? You don't know their strategy. You are never going to know more about what's happening than the people who are living through it right now. So just be humble and keep your mouth shut unless you can be helpful. But I mean, I'll keep it short, but I would, of course, I'm just going to say, join a union, organize your workplace, get involved with your local labor community. If you're an independent contractor, yeah, labor law is not kind to us, but there are other people in your position that you can organize with, as we've been seeing from drivers to freelance writers. Like there's always someone else who's going through the same thing you are, and then finding them and reaching out to them, like that you formed, like that's the beginning of your next committee, like that's the beginning of your group. And in like you're talking about the workplaces that are more atomized, where you're not necessarily going to see your coworkers all the time, you gotta put a little elbow grease in, get some emails, like actively try to meet them in the parking lot. Like it is so important to talk to people. And it's easier to text. People don't even like calling that much anymore, but you just gotta talk to people, right? Because that's how you're going to get to know them. That's how you're going to find out about your shared struggles. You're going to find out that you're not the only person experiencing what you're experiencing, because that's a lonely and scary feeling, but you're never the only one. And if you are the only one having a specific issue, there's going to be other issues that you can connect on, because we're all, as members of the working class, we're all dealing with so many different pressures, but there is a lot that we have in common. And finding that common ground is going to be, one of your greatest weapons for going forward and winning whatever fight you're trying to win. So yeah, join a union, form a union, organize a union. It's a good start at the very least.
Very good. Supriya?
Yeah, I was going to jump in and say, make friends with more journalists, because I'm absolutely, because I trained as a journalist, but I'm following the story. The farmers' protests in India are something that have been on and off the news in different parts, but there was also a young woman from the city that I spent much of my adolescent years, Bangalore, 21-year-old girl who was 21-year-old woman who was arrested on sedition charges because of her involvement in adding some information on a global toolkit that was being organized by Greta Thunberg to sort of help support the farmer protests. And she was arrested by the government on sedition charges, right? And so there is a lot that I think is happening at sort of government level, at structural levels, and the more eyes on stories, the better it is, because I think that we don't do enough organizing in the downtime across professions. So there are a lot of different academics, journalists, think tanks, NGOs, you know, we're operating in bubbles, but there's not enough cross-pollination across these spaces so that we build some interactive networks that actually provide pressure from different angles rather than a single component and single angle.
Thank you. Avir?
I'll just add, you know, the system we have individualizes us, keeps us apart from each other. And whether it's building connections with journalists, other organizations, your coworkers, your co-tenants, whatever, we gotta bridge that gap. And so maybe to just sum it up, I would say, be social, talk to people. It starts with just that.
Very good. Thank you. Thank you all so much. I know we do have some questions in the chat. Olivia, could you pull a question from the chat for us to start us out with another question for the group?
Sure thing. And if anyone wants to raise their hand to ask a question as well, I'll try to balance between raised hands and chats. So to start us off, we have a question from William, who asks, how can or should we handle engagements with people who claim to be apolitical or refuse to engage in politics?
I can, oh, go for it.
Go ahead.
No, we had a lot of that at Kickstarter. It's like a feeling of, oh, it's not professional to bring politics into the workplace or anything like that. And all I can say is people may say that they are apolitical, but they aren't without struggles and challenges and issues that you just have to sort of dig for those and say like, hey, what's, like Ifeoma said, like, what is keeping you from doing the things you want to do? Or yeah, just sort of leave politics out of it. It's just you and your coworkers coming together, and it's a very natural thing when we leave politics out of it, actually.
I was going to kind of actually say the flip of Clarissa, but I think with the same end answer, like everything is political, right? Like what you get paid versus what your coworker gets paid. The fact that you have a coworker and a boss, those are all political things. So being able to understand how to interact with people and tie those individual, like personal things into larger, like global social political issues, I think is incredibly important. But yeah, you start with the small individual personal items.
By the way, I think today is Equal Pay Day for women. So thought I'd just throw that into the conversation. Ifeoma, go ahead.
Yeah, I said not for all women, unfortunately, which is something we have to remember.
Oh,
yeah.
Okay. Who else? Does anyone else want to speak about the political, apolitical, and political issues in the workplace?
I would just say to agree with, Avir and Clarissa about how everything is personal, everything's political, whether or not bringing in political, you don't need to be a socialist to be upset about the potholes or about hearing about folks who aren't able to pay their medical bills or about, everybody hates their boss. Maybe not everybody. Most people have disagreements with management, we'll say, and that's a pretty easy end to be like, oh, that seems unfair, that doesn't seem right, what do you think of this, how does this impact you? Like, not everyone is selfless. Some people are just focusing on their own stuff, trying to get by. Maybe it's a little selfish, but making an issue that has global implications and much broader implications and kind of pulling it into like, here's how this impacts you, and gosh, that doesn't seem right, does it? Like, it's a pretty easy conversation because everyone's pissed off about something. You just have to figure out what it is and how to channel that in a productive way.
Supriya, did you want to add anything?
No, I was just I was looking at one of the other questions about social media on there, sorry. But
That's
no,
all
I
right.
think-
You can answer that one too.
Well, there was a question there that I was writing to Andrea about social media have been more force for good. And I was just going to say, in the Indian context, the ability to freeze these accounts, to limit, knowledge sharing, and it has been really just a really powerful tool on the side of the government. But
Yeah.
in terms of sort of the notion of the other question, I was thinking about everything is systemic. And I think drawing people into understanding how they belong to a system, maybe more so than politics, is probably one way to have that conversation, because we all belong to these systems that we're almost in some ways incapable of sort of freeing ourselves from. So where do we fit in that cog, even if that sounds depressing?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, occasionally when I teach an undergraduate foundations of education class, some students who may be freshmen will say, no, education's not political at all. It's a different thing. Politics is here, education is there. And I'm like, okay. First day of class, kind of, okay, you're going to learn a lot in this class. And the other thing, I think a student in the panel this morning was saying something about, related to what Kim was just saying about people having their individual needs and, the space where they are individually, is that it's been so difficult during the pandemic, especially for students who may want to be activists, may want to be out there doing more, but the overabundance of Zoom classes and Zoom meetings and the isolation and the whole lack of ability to gather has been very difficult for students to sometimes have that extra energy and effort to do the activism work that they might want to do. Yeah. Olivia, did anyone else want to address the social media question? Olivia, can you read what that question was?
Sorry, let me find it in the chat. Has social media been more of a force for good for the labor struggle, or given the untimely boycott calls, has social media been more problematic as unhelpful strategies spread quickly?
I would say that it's been more of a blessing than a curse. And I mean, this Amazon pseudo boycott thing was unfortunate. It was a headache. It was well intentioned though. And that's not indicative of how all social media works in the labor world. I would say, especially as someone who's a journalist and who's made a lot of connections with other people in the labor community through Twitter specifically. And I know there's people on Facebook too, but I'm not really over there. That's good. Yeah. Facebook is its own thing. All that to say, it has been very useful for fostering connections, whether it's between journalists and union officials or rank and file workers. It has made it seem, and it's grown like kind of its own little community of, like, there's labor Twitter exists, and that is a very helpful thing for people that are sharing sources and tips and stories, and it is a good thing. And it is getting is drawing more attention from the rest of the world, from the rest of the public, who maybe aren't going to pay attention to this contract campaign or that strike or that fight. But if you are in a union who's dealing with that and you have a good social media person, they can come up with a strategy to actually get people to pay attention. And that is just another tool that they can use to get public perception on their side and put more pressure on the boss. It is actually, and I'll speak to my experience a little bit, because I used to work at Vice for a long time before they laid me off. Classic. And when we were organizing the union there, we use social media really effectively to put pressure on the company to, play ball, whether it was changing our avatars or putting out calls for people to sign petitions, calling for support. Like we see this a lot in like talking about Kickstarter too, like any way that you can get eyeballs on what's happening in a productive and helpful way, like that's a huge win. Yes, there's going to be missteps. We're going to have, miscommunications. There's going to be some well-intentioned screw ups. But I think ultimately it has been really helpful, because labor isn't necessarily the sexy thing to talk about. It's not the easiest thing to get people to pay attention to. So using every tool we have to be like, look, no, this really matters. Like, please pay attention, like, because this could happen to you next, I think is a net good, even if the headaches exist.
So we have a raised hand in the audience from Sarah. So go ahead and ask your question.
Hi, thanks, Olivia. Can you hear me okay? Okay, thanks. So I put it in the chat before, but it like disappeared. That might just be because I switched devices. But I wanted to know about the role that police unions play in the global labor struggle, because I know that they play a very prominent role in often suppressing resistance and protests. So how does a police union factor into all this global solidarity talk?
I'll jump in on that because I had the great pleasure of calling out Mary Kay Henry, the president of SEIU, on why their BLM support statement explicitly allowed cop unions, like recognize the right for cop unions. Sorry, I saw Kim's face, and that was kind of the exact attitude I had. I'll say what the labor's official labor position is, and then I'll say why I disagree with it. Their position is, if you have the cops in-house, you can rein them in, you have some level to exert influence on them. Personally, I think that's kind of wrong. Right? Cops in general are the enemy of labor. It is cops who protect private property. It is cops who crush strikes. It is cops who beat down people of color. Like in the 1990s, there was a strike, Justice for Janitors strike, or Janitors for Justice, I forget what it was called. That was, working class people of color led campaign, and they were brutally repressed by the police. Under no circumstances can cops be friends with labor. And police unions, I think, are actually just a way to misuse the rhetoric of the working class to defend a protective unit for the body that violently protects capital. So what cops unions do, I think, Sarah, you're probably very familiar with this if you're asking the question. They protect bad cops. All cops are bad, but they exert undue influence. And unlike working class organizations, which withhold profits for the sake of the protection of workers, cops withhold their labor at the expense of public safety. So in my opinion, it's really just like a false flag operation, to use maybe some weird terminology, but to make it seem like it has a working class character when what it really does is support the existing institutions.
And that was a fantastic answer. Thank you for laying that out much more eloquently than I could have, and with much less profanity, I would say. But I mean, there's the fundamental misunderstanding is that, cops aren't workers. They are an arm of the state. They are managers at best. But most managers are not able to murder people with impunity and then just go back to work the next day. Like I understand that this is not everyone has this particular view, not in labor movement, and that is fine. But there are a bunch of us who do. There has been in the past year specifically, there has been a groundswell of little grassroots rank and file led efforts like No Cop Unions, SEIU Drop the Cops, IATSE Against Racism. There are a number of groups organizing within labor who want to kick the cops out because they don't belong here. We should not be associating with strike breakers, with blacklegs, with murderers. I mean, I do not think it is a difficult question, but leadership on the national level does. And that is the kind of tension that we're going to be having to deal with for a long time. But I have a lot of opinions about this that I will keep to myself just for the sake of harmony. But yeah, cops aren't workers and they have no place in the labor movement. And whatever we can do to get rid of them will be another step towards global justice.
Thank you for the awesome answers. I want to move on to another question in the chat. This is from Ryan, who asks, is any of this work related to trying to make public that which is private? So for example, healthcare, childcare, wages, and driving.
Who would like to speak about that, the private public dialectic or issues? Yeah.
I could maybe venture something, though I won't go to kind of follow up on Kim's last statement of withholding comments for the sake of harmony. I won't go too far into the answer, my own answer.
Okay.
But I definitely think raising the consciousness of the general society of the issues of the privatization of so many basic necessities, the way we take care of people, the way we transport things, just the way we take care of each other, how the difficulties and the contradictions that brings up. Yes, I think that's an incredibly important thing to make people aware of. There are benefits to making things public. For example, with healthcare, I think it was Ifeoma who mentioned, right, if people don't have to worry about healthcare, it's so much easier to bring up issues on the job. I wouldn't go so far, personally at least, I wouldn't go so far as to say that it is as simple as should we make things public or private. I think there are issues with both choices in that duality that requires a third solution. But yeah, just raising the awareness of the issues that things present, the privatization presents, I think is certainly a first step.
Anyway, yeah, Supriya.
Sure. I was going to say this is an interesting question only because I see this from the perspective not private as much as hidden, right? And how much of this is the work of women or brown, Black and brown bodies that are engaged in these activities, poor bodies that are engaged in these efforts. And so, yeah, I think that there is that tension between what we'd prefer not to see, what's sort of stuffed in the back closet, I've cleaned my room, I put everything away, but if you open the closet, you see like all of the things I don't want to see and I don't want to do. I mean, that's a horrible metaphor, but it's sort of one that you're thinking about, after a really robust, rich conversation, but, sort of it's in there and I'd rather not look at it. And so whatever is the dominant hegemonic power in whatever society determines what they want their front yard to look like. And the things that they don't have to deal with are in the backyard. And that backyard tends to be people who have far less power, far less visibility, far less autonomy to make decisions in their day-to-day lives that allow them the agency to be able to advocate for themselves and for their families in regard to the kinds of things that they'd like to see change. So, yeah.
Ifeoma, I know you wanted to say something too. Thank you, Supriya.
Yeah, I was going to say that it's about power, fundamentally. It's about power over who has the autonomy to make decisions. When we think about healthcare, if you have enough money, health insurance is not something you ever think about in this country. If you have enough money to pay for, I don't know, cancer, if it randomly strikes. When you're thinking about childcare, that's, again, these are roles and jobs that, because of the history of this country, certain people have filled. And so we as a society have decided that they're not important and that they should be private, because individuals should have power over the person who's taking care of their children. Like, when you think about that and how it's so fundamentally tied to slavery, like, you can't ignore that power is the thing controlling all of this.
Thank you. We have about 4 minutes left for our official time. So I wanted to just give everyone an opportunity to give a final statement or, express an idea about, again, how people get involved, or just a final idea that you'd like to share with the group? Oh, Marianne wants to say something.
Oh, I just had a quick question, because the subject of health insurance and healthcare keeps coming up. But we hosted a summer school for women in labor unions and worker organizations a couple of years ago at Hofstra with the CUNY school, and we had these great women, and they were it was incredibly diverse in terms of people in unions and worker organizations, racial diversity, sexual diversity, everything. But what was amazing to me was we had a keynote speaker who's actually a Hofstra alum, Jessica Ramos, and she was talking about the New York Health Act and the resistance to universal health care from labor, from these really kind of super bad labor women. And I wondered if you had any last thoughts about that. I mean, Ifeoma, I totally hear you. I had young kids before I had like the guaranteed insurance of my job. And even when I first started working here, I didn't have to pay for it. So that's always on my mind when my kids were little, is I can never lose my job, right? Or they're screwed, which means I'm screwed. But what do you make of like labor defending employer provided health insurance? I mean, that seems to me to be like a real bummer for the movement, no?
Well, in context, it does make a certain kind of sense depending on the union, depending on the deal. Because when you're negotiating a union contract, healthcare is obviously a big part of it. Some unions have been able to negotiate really, really robust, like top of the line healthcare for their members. And so they don't want to lose that. They don't want the idea of, they reject the idea of having to accept a lower quality substitute, like something like Medicare for All. But not every union has been able to achieve that. The Culinary Workers Union, Local 226 in Las Vegas, Nevada, they have Cadillac health insurance. Like, they are all in on it. But most unions have not quite pulled that off. And so that's kind of where that tension comes from, the thought of losing something that you fought really hard to keep and not knowing what the alternative is. It could be better, it could be worse. I think that that question is what makes people kind of circle the wagons a little bit. Like you said, if you have a family and someone's offering you like you've been drinking Coke your whole life and someone offers you a diet soda, you're like, well, I don't know about all that. So that's where that tension comes from.
I think also that it speaks to a lack of solidarity, honestly, across all of labor. Just because your union has something doesn't mean that that's where you should stop. My fight would be such that everyone has access to the same sort of care that I have. And it's also short-sighted, because once you're out of the role, then what? like you can't just be focused on what you get, although that should be at the top of your list, what you get while you're in the role. People move on. And so people should be protected outside of the union context.
If anyone else wants to add to the healthcare or make a final statement about things. Callie, did you have a hand up? No. Okay.
Yes, I would say, taking from this discussion and going back to what we were talking about at the beginning of this panel, right? There is a individualization going on where individual unions are concerned with what they can get for their members with the companies they work with. But right now we are seeing with drivers, with Amazon workers, with Instacart workers and beyond, the start of a new labor. It's just starting out, it's just growing, but what needs to happen is those gaps need to be bridged. I mean, there needs to be connections built up between these various movements so that instead of having that individual justice, that individual activity, we can get activity across the class for the class.
Right. So in healthcare, Medicare for all, some people agree, some people don't, but that idea. Anyone else want to give a final? Yeah, Supriya, go ahead.
Sorry, I didn't mean to. No, the random thought, the random person might not think politics matters, but I think that we could argue that politics is everything and voting matters. And so keeping an eye on and maybe reaching out to people in states where there are so many different measures that are being passed to prevent and restrict voting is going to be, I think, the biggest issue for organizing and solidarity and global justice and individual justice over the next year. So not to sort of put that in our rearview mirror.
So we're just about out of time now. This is the end of our panel, but I just want to thank everyone for coming. And thank you so much to all the panelists. Huge digital round of applause for everyone.
Yay.
And thank you all for coming.